He's 92. I think his birthday is in the next month or so. And you might think he would be content to rest on his laurels, his considerable laurels, but he is not. He and his fantastic wife, Audrey, Topping, are still hammering away. Their 5 daughters are grown now. We are lucky enough to have 3 of them with us, Robin, Leslie, and Joanna. Please stand up over here. Robin's husband, Kevin Kieran, is also here, and Jason Cohn, the son of the Toppings, one of the 2 missing daughters, Karen, also is here. Jason, you might have heard yesterday afternoon on WCBS Radio in his capacity as communications director of Doctors Without Borders, and he was talking about the tragedy in the Philippines. Now, before we get to Top, Audrey has a fascinating new book out, which I just happen to have, called China Mission. It's about, if you count the daughters, 4 generations of her family and their connections from the last imperial dynasty to the People's Republic. Now, there may be somebody who knows more about China than the 2 Toppings, but I don't know who they might be. Now, among his many activities, Top is a board member of the Overseas Press Club of America and the active chairman of the editorial board of World Policy Journal. As I am sure our fellow Silurian, David Andelman, the editor of that august publication, will attest, Top is a constant source of wise counsel and editorial knowledge. Mr. Topping's most recent book, 3 years old and issued recently in paperback, is this one, On the Front Lines of the Cold War, an American correspondence journal from the Chinese Civil War to the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam. Top has been a journalist of note for nearly 7 decades. Although I suppose if he were starting out now, that number would be closer to 8 decades. He would have been a blogger even before he went to the University of Missouri Journalism School to pursue his dream as a 16-year-old to follow Edgar Snow's footsteps as a reporter in China. As it was, he was a ripe 24 in November 1946 when he ended his U.S. Army service in the Philippines to move to Peking to learn Chinese and fulfill his ambition of becoming a foreign correspondent. The International News Service gave him his first assignment, and as he put it in this book, Journey Between Two Chinas, they gave him the pretentious title of Chief Correspondent of North China and Manchuria. His salary was $50 a month plus space. Within a year, he was hired by the Associated Press to cover the epic battles between Chiang Kai-shek and the forces of Mao Zedong. In Nanking in 1949, he scored a worldwide scoop about the fall of Chiang Kai-shek and the winning march of the communists. By 1950, he was opening the AP bureau in Saigon, and after a series of successes across Southeast Asia, he moved to London and Berlin. The New York Times hired him in 1959, and in 1960 sent him, along with Audrey, to Moscow as bureau chief, where the 2 of them, as I hope we will hear, enjoyed encountering Mr. Khrushchev, among others. Ultimately, Top became the managing editor of the Times, and then editorial director of the Times' 32 regional newspapers. In his retirement, and I use that word loosely, he spent 9 years running the Pulitzer Prizes. He taught journalism in China and the United States, and like a Timex watch, he just keeps on ticking. Now, that short version of his career leads me to our Lifetime Achievement Award. Top, I'd like you to come up here and let me give you the plaque here. Now, in a second, I'm going to read this. Okay. Let me read this plaque. To Seymour Topping, in recognition of your outstanding contributions to excellence in journalism and the sum of public knowledge. As a distinguished foreign correspondent, editor, news executive, Pulitzer Prize administrator, educator, mentor, husband, and father, you stand as an indefatigable, fearless, insightful, and fair-minded pillar of integrity and friendship for news people everywhere. Thank you. Now, okay, it's all yours.
Better than Wimbledon.
Now let's see if we can get this mic to work for the person that matters.
Thank you, Alan. You've already stolen some of my best lines, but I'll forgive you for that. And all I can say is it's so wonderful to be here, to meet some old friends, people from the Times. As a matter of fact, I looked around the room and I spotted at least 4 people that I hired. And they all turned out to be great. Isn't that right, Al Siegel? Okay, let's not waste any time. Let me tell them a few things about Audrey and myself and our adventures around the world.
We'd love to hear it.
Okay. First, shall I hold this?
You can hold it, but I'm worried that you'll wave it. I'll keep it on you.
Okay. This is going to take some time. Okay.
Take as much time as you like.
Okay.
But here, I'm going to hold the mic close to you.
Okay. First, my heartfelt thanks, fellow Silurians, for the honor you've bestowed on me. I think the occasion calls for a bit of formality, and so let me say, awarded by you, veterans, the pros, men and women who have lived journalism to the fullest. It represents an honor of the most unique distinction and significance. So thank you so much. As you know, I served for many years as an editor at the New York Times. And to start with, I'm not going to talk about that. For one thing, Warren Hogue has told all, including some things he shouldn't have told, as you will see. But I'll be glad to answer questions about my experience at the Times. But I thought it might be more fun to talk about the old days, going back perhaps to a time when many of you were still in grade school. So let me proceed. As Alan told you, my career began in 1946 in the Philippines after I served 3 years as an Army infantry officer. In a Manila bar, my only journalist experience being the School of Journalism at the University of Missouri, a great school, as you mentioned. I talked my way over drinks into a job with the International News Service as a stringer in Beijing covering the Chinese Civil War. Yes, my official title was Chief Correspondent for North China and Manchuria, and at $50 a month I had to live on what I earned in the Army, but I did have a few payments for what made the wire. When I landed in Beijing, then called Peking, I was still wearing the uniform of an Army captain. I rented a room in a missionary-operated Chinese language school, And in between my sorties, my ventures into the battlefields, and I did many of them, I took lessons. And I got myself a Chinese-made civilian suit. It was rather ill-fitting, but never mind, and a typewriter. And then I began reporting. 2 months later, I wrangled a trip on a U.S. Air Force plane to Yan'an, Mao Zedong's cave headquarters in remote Shaanxi province. It was being blockaded by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops. It was an historic moment. I was at a dinner with members of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo when Mao Zedong broke off his negotiations with General Marshall, President Truman's envoy, and Chiang Kai-shek on a Civil War peace agreement. This was Mao's response to Truman's fatal mistake of adding yet another huge delivery of armaments to the nationalists, whom he'd already outfitted with tons of weapons and an air force. At the dinner table, General Juda, the military commander-in-chief of Mao's then outnumbered People's Liberation Army, he turned to me and said bitterly, "This is the final proof that the United States is committed to unilateral support of Chiang Kai-shek. Historically, this was the breaking point in relations with the United States, which would not begin to be mended until the visit of President Nixon in 1972. In that standoff period with the Chinese, at terrible cost, we tangled with Mao's force in Korea, costing us thousands of our young people and treasure. And also we tangled with Chinese advisors to Ho Chi Minh in Indochina. One of my handicaps in working for the parsimonious INS, I hope nobody's here is working for Hearst, it was a subsidiary, was the insistence that I file my copy by postal mail, unless it was a very big story, because sending it by cable was just too expensive. This, of course, gave my competitor, the celebrated Reynolds Packet of the United Press, you remember the guy who always said, "I'm writing for the Kansas City Milkman," it gave him a great advantage. One day, Packet scored a scoop when he reported that a Chinese peasant had found a spider with a human head. He wasn't talking about our people in Washington. He picked this up from the lurid Chinese press. The story, strangely enough, caused a worldwide stir. But INS was not to be moved by this budget-wise. I received instructions from the INS New York desk, honestly, don't cable unless you can find a spider with 2 human heads. So it was with INS. I resigned from INS the next year and joined the Associated Press in Nanking. It was a great move. I consider the AP today as then one of the greatest institutions in the world. Nanking, as you know, is on Chiang Kai-shek's capital at that time on the Yangtze River. Blessed, I met there and courted the beautiful Audrey Ronning, daughter of the Minister Counselor of the Canadian Legation. She was then a student at the University of Nanking and a newscaster at the radio station of the U.S. Military Advisory Group. And I think you may recall it, Audrey, that moonlit night as we picnicked atop Purple Mountain, you consented to marry me. But shortly afterwards, she was evacuated to Japan with her mother and siblings, as were all women and children of the diplomatic community, a precaution since Mao's army was battling its way towards the city. And my next contact with Audrey would be under the most extraordinary circumstances, and I'll get to that later. There was no Western correspondent with the Communist Army advancing on Nanking, and I conceived a plan to win fame. I was young and a little foolish as that correspondent. I would go to Pengpu on the Huai River far north of Nanking. I would hide out in the Italian Jesuit mission there and wait for the communists to occupy the town. I would then emerge. Here's Seymour of the AP. Take me to Mao Zedong for an interview. How about that? Harold Milks, the AP bureau chief in Nanking, was very skeptical, understandably so, but he okayed the venture. And on December 12th, 1949, I climbed into the boxcar of a nationalist troop train in Pengpu. The kindly bishop at the Jesuit mission admitted me, and I waited for the communists to come as the nationalist troops retreated through the town, and there was in the distance, there was a approaching gunfire. On Christmas Eve, Harold Milks filed a brief story describing me, and I quote, "the loneliest Associated Press staffer in the whole world this Christmas Eve." In Vancouver, where she was attending the University of British Columbia, strolling along a city avenue, Audrey noticed a rain-sodden newspaper lying on the sidewalk with a big headline about the Chinese Civil War. And she picked it up, and at the bottom of the front page saw a box with Milk's story about my lonely Pengpu vigil. She forgave me then for the lack of communication. In Pengpu, impatiently, on New Year's Day, I crossed the nationalist front lines on the Huai River with a couple of peasants helping with my baggage. Not far into no man's land, we were captured by trigger-happy communist guerrillas, and I narrowly escaped being gunned down by a submachine gun. I was taken on foot and by horse far north to a communist headquarters near a battlefield where the final phase of the Battle of the Huai Hai was taking place. It was a battle which Chinese historians would later, understandably so, and correctly compare to Gettysburg. The final phase was unfolding there. About 130,000 nationalist troops at this particular phase of the battle were surrounded there by 300,000 communist troops. And I listened to them being bombarded every night for the next week. I was interrogated on my arrival by a political commissar, my camera and typewriter taken away, and I was confined in a peasant hut, and at times the area was strafed by nationalist fighter planes. No invitation to my requested interview with Mao was forthcoming. As a matter of policy, and recalling what I just referred to about what happened in Yan'an, Mao was no longer speaking to Americans. After a week, when the guns fell silent, indicating that the nationalist positions of the troops surrounded had been overrun, the commissar came into the hut and commanded, "Pack. Your horse is outside." When I pressed him about a meeting with Mao, he replied, "Go." With an escort, I was led back to the nationalist lines, and in Nanking, I filed my story. I discussed this in some length, not to tell you what a courageous correspondent I was, but for this reason. In the decisive battle of the Huai Hai, the communists, in 65 days of fighting across the central China plain, knocked out about 500,000 national troops, 500,000, and opened the way to Nanking and Shanghai. The decisive battle of the Civil War. General David Barr, Chiang Kai-shek's American advisor, attributed this nationalist disaster to the incompetence of the Generalissimo and his corrupt generals, whom he described to me as the worst leadership in the world. On April 24th, I met the communists again. They had crossed the Yangtze and were breaking into Nanking through the northwest gate. And I met them with Bill Guan, a reporter of Agence France Presse. A communist officer pushing his weary troops who had been fighting hard into the city told me to go back. The nationalists had retreated from the city. Government buildings were aflame. Mobs were looting the houses of the nationalist officials who had fled south. Guan and I flipped a coin to decide who would file first. He won. And he sent a 3-word dispatch. Reds take Nanking. I filed an 85-word dispatch just before the cable was cut between Nanking and Shanghai. When Guan's report, his dispatch, his 3 words, reached Agence France Presse in Paris, they waited for the next take. My dispatch went straight onto the AP wire, giving me a world beat on the fall of the capital. I never found out if those Agence France deskmen got fired. On the first day of occupation of Nanking, a squad of PLA, communist soldiers, found a radio transmitter in the AP compound. I was put under house arrest. I managed, through the embassy, to get a coded message out to Fred Hampson, the AP staffer in Shanghai. Message: Boy Scouts at my door. Hampson promptly filed a story about my arrest. Several days later, the guards disappeared and I was free to move about the city. After 6 months in occupied Nanking, during which the city was bombed highly ineffectively by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist bombers, I made my way to Hong Kong, then to Camrose, Alberta, Audrey's hometown, where 64 years ago this week we were married. Thank you. We returned to Hong Kong, Audrey and I. I flew immediately to Hainan Island, where a great battle was taking place. It was the last battle of the nationalist retreat from the mainland. And then a message arrived in Hong Kong from the AP Foreign Desk saying something is going on in Saigon, Indonesia. Saigon, Indonesia. That was indicative of how vague and how distant and how remote Saigon was at that time. Audrey and I left for Saigon, yes, Vietnam, and checking into the Continental Hotel, when he started packing, there was an enormous explosion in the street below our window. A rickshaw driver had thrown a bomb into the sidewalk cafe. The bodies of the dead and wounded French soldiers and sailors lay strewn on the terrace and the street. That was our introduction to the French Indochina War. When Truman pledged support to the French, I opened the AP Saigon Bureau. They guessed at that time it was quite a good story, and I covered the war for 2 years. And Audrey, at my side, Audrey took time out from her work as a photojournalist to give birth to Susan, the first of our 5 daughters, in a French military hospital to the sound of gunfire as the Viet Minh were at that moment attacking a French army post on the perimeter. There was also an unforgettable afternoon of October 20th, 1951, when there was a knock on the door of our apartment in Saigon. And when I opened the door, Congressman John F. Kennedy stood there, alone. Greeting us, he said, "I'll only be a few minutes." He didn't look very well. He'd been traveling through Asia and had some difficult time, spent some time in a hospital, as a matter of fact. He was on a study tour of Asia with Bobby and Sister Patricia. He had been told that I was the first American correspondent stationed in Indochina. He had a lot of questions, and when he left, he seemed to share our view that the colonial French could not defeat the Ho Chi Minh. His whole experience in that short visit with Bobby to Saigon in later years influenced some of his decision-making. After Indochina, it was on to London, Berlin, and then Moscow for the Times. And let me, taking a bit of time with these perhaps twice told stories, I must tell you one of the most memorable instances of how Audrey and I worked closely as journalist partners. Moscow, November 7th, 1962. We are at a diplomatic reception in the Palace of Congresses in the Kremlin. It was the 45th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Cheers. This was the first time that Americans had been invited to the Kremlin since the eruption of the ongoing Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Gilded Hall, Nikita Khrushchev and other members of the Soviet Politburo stood at a long table exchanging vodka toasts, displaying their solidarity in this missile crisis. Suddenly, I saw Audrey walking to a spot directly in front of Khrushchev, take her Leica out of her evening bag, and begin photographing the Soviet leader. She had ignored the KGB order to check all cameras at the door. I saw a swarm of KGB agents converging on her, but Khrushchev waved them off and posed smiling for Audrey, this blonde apparition, understandably so. When Khrushchev began to mingle with the guests, I approached him, asked about the missile crisis, and he said, "Tension has not completely eased, but our rockets are out of Cuba. We were very close, very, very close to a thermonuclear war." The next morning, Audrey's photographs of Khrushchev were on the front page of the New York Times above my story on the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. With that anniversary impending of President Kennedy's death, I am once again reliving the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the Times New York office, back from Moscow and en route to Southeast Asia to become the chief correspondent there. Moments after Tom Wicker flashed the news that the president had been shot, it was discovered inexplicably that there was no advance obit for the young president. Homer Bigot, the great war correspondent, happened to be in Washington at the same time, and he and I were called upon to write the obit. By 6:30 p.m., the president died at 2 p.m. We had written the obit, which would become a page in the Times. We then went to a bar and talked about Kennedy, and Homer went into a phone booth there and called Jane, his wife, to tell her what happened. and I watched the war correspondent weeping. Afterwards, I walked across Times Square, and the lights were dimmed, to the Astor Hotel, where I was to spend the night. It was a sleepless night. I wept for Kennedy. I wept for my country. And I wondered what Kennedy would have done about Vietnam if he had lived. In the morning, I scribbled notes. The world had changed and become more unpredictable. Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow centurions, thank you for your attention. Once again, my profound thanks for this award.
Now, before we get to questions, I don't know what to say about that. We've only got up to 1963, I think, right? And before I got a little flummoxed by the microphone situation, I had a little plan to call on one of the other Toppings practicing journalism, Robin, because I think she represents the daughter's view, as I understand it, that two of Top's other books may be more fun than all the facts. And so let me have her talk about it for 1 second.
Okay. Well, there were two things that I wanted to say about my dad, and I don't really know if it has to do with Alan's agenda, but I'll say them anyway. The one thing that I think most of you know about my parents is they're actually secretly 25. Right? You guys know that. Because whenever I call home, which is often, they're always doing something that I wish I was doing. They're traveling someplace, they're writing a new book, they're releasing a new book, and they're just always on the road in their minds and elsewhere. So the one thing that I always kept in mind was when I was young, my father would come on a Saturday and he would have lunch with us, but I could always tell when he was writing a book because the rest of us would be eating and my dad would just sort of be out there. He'd be in China, he'd be in Vietnam, he'd be all kinds of places, but he wasn't with us. And but that's what you had to do. I think his first book he had to write in 3 months. As I recall, Dad, you took 3 months off while you were still managing editor to write Journey Between Two Chinas. So in 3 months, he was able to write that book, which is pretty darn good. So that was one of the first things I wanted to say. And the second thing I wanted to say was that one of the nice things about my dad is that he's a good soul. And that's verified for me every time I come to an event like this, when any one of the correspondents who have worked with him, Warren, they always come up to me and say, you know, your dad kind of rescued me, or, you know, your dad was the only one who would listen to me, or your dad kind of saved me. And he does that a lot. He saves people. And that's because in journalism, it's not always easy to find a good manager or a good leader, right? We're all sort of independent people who really don't want to have anything to do with other people. We're always doing our own thing. So it's very hard to find somebody who can do all that and also be a leader and a manager and inspire people. But I can tell you that my dad does that. And he's a great journalist, and he also has a good heart, and he's a good man. And so that's what I wanted to say. The novels. Oh, that's right. That's what I was supposed to do. My dad has written 4 novels. 3? Peking Letter.
3.
Peking Letter, Fatal Vision, and you're going to have to tell me the third. And Fatal Crossroads, I'm sorry. And I guess the thing that I most remember about these novels is that as his daughter, I always knew he was a great journalist and a terrific historian, but I really didn't know that he was a great novelist too, or that my mother is a great novelist. But the most difficult thing about reading those books for the first time was that there were love scenes. Well, my dad was writing love scenes, and I have to say they were pretty darn good. So it kind of shows, I think, the flexibility and scope and breadth of both my parents, that they can do the journalist thing, and then they can do the novelist thing.
Speaking about love scenes, I think if I'm not stealing Warren's fire here, when we were in Moscow at that time with 3 of our daughters, we lived in this.
Somebody said 4.
Four.
I think it might have been one of the daughters.
4. The 5th came later. We lived in this small apartment. The kids slept in double deckers in what was a converted baggage room, and Audrey and I, with in a small bedroom with a double bed. And one night, the lighting fixture at the foot of the bed exploded. And when we looked at it slowly, there was a listening device in there. And the KGB had been hearing some interesting pillow talk.
Now, before I turn it over to questions, I want to exercise my prerogative and ask one or two. But I first have to say, who else can you name who had a worldwide scoop by being a gentleman? I mean, he lost the flip and he won the war. Unbelievable. Just still blows my mind every time I hear that story. But I'm really curious about something that I read in one of your books, and I'm sure the crowd would like to know how it is that you went to the University of Missouri and became a polo player.
Yeah. Well, it was one of life's challenges. At Missouri, there was the ROTC, and the ROTC there was horse-drawn field artillery that was required for the first 2 years, and I went out to the stables on the first day, and I tried to get on a horse from the wrong side, and it threw me. These were most of my classmates. They were Missouri farm boys, and somehow it, well, shall I say, irked me or challenged me. And from the next day on, I spent more time out in the stables riding than I guess into the classes. And finally, in my junior year, I made the team.
Sir, you mentioned your meeting face-to-face with John F. Kennedy in Saigon as the Vietnamese War was developing. I'm curious about what you think his actions would have been had he lived. Of course, Lyndon Johnson, we know, was escalation, it was escalation, it was escalation.
When I was thinking of that, on the night of the day he died, it was difficult to puzzle it out because, if you recall, Nojin Jem had been assassinated. The president had not agreed to his killing, but it agreed to the CIA operation which inspired that action, and everything was confused. One of the things about Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, to whom he was so close in making all of his decisions, was they were absolutely convinced, and if I may say so, possibly part of it came from that meeting with Audrey and I in the apartment, when I told him that when we first arrived, Americans were the most popular people in the world among the Vietnamese people, and now we are hated, and their hero is Ho Chi Minh. And Kennedy was determined to try to find a government that could attract the people away from Ho Chi Minh. I did considerable research on this question after that day in Dallas, and as nearly as I could tell, he might have been coming close to what Bobby was urging, and what he finally came out publicly and proposed. And that was that the United States would reach out to Ho Chi Minh and for a deal. The deal would be we would stop the bombing of North Vietnam. We'd begin a gradual withdrawal of American troops, and in return, you would agree that Vietnam would come under UN supervision, and on the UN leadership, there would be a peace settlement. Now, of course, if that had happened and had been general elections, there was no question that who would win. It would be Ho Chi Minh at that time. Perhaps not later, when he became guilty of those atrocities after the takeover. But the possibility of Ho Chi Minh being elected, one has to recall that in the 1954 Geneva Accords, there was an agreement that there would be a plebiscite, a general elections in after a certain period of time in Vietnam, and what happened when the time for elections came? Diem, the premier, reneged with some encouragement from the United States. So this idea that Bobby Kennedy had was not that far out, and would have been possibly the road that the president would have taken.
First, I want to say I was delighted when the Silurians asked me to write the appreciation of Seymour Topping. Such is my admiration.
Come up to the front, because then everybody can hear you.
I was delighted to be asked to write the appreciation of Seymour Topping. Such is my affection and admiration for this mind, an admiration for this man, an admiration shared by so many of my colleagues at the New York Times. Something I realized in researching it, and I don't think all of us who not were contemporaries of Top, but contemporaries of mine who worked for Topping, I don't think we realize fully the career he had before he became the distinguished managing editor of the New York Times. The great education for me was finding out what Top has been talking about tonight, the years in China, in Vietnam, later in Berlin, in Europe. And the fact that he stops at 1963 is not surprising, because there was so much accomplishment until that moment. And I hadn't appreciated it fully, and I really do know, having had the chance to write this piece. I've listened with great interest to Top's version right now. I want to add something here, which is the romantic topping. And I'm looking at you as I say this. Among the stories you will read, if you get around to reading what I've written for the Silurian News about Top, is what happened in 1949 in Nanking. And think now of a black and white movie, a wartime movie. Topping goes one night to the officers' club and meets the beautiful, and by the way, she was as beautiful then as she is now. I mean, talk about preservation. Top goes to the officers' club and meets Audrey Ronning, then the daughter, as you've heard tonight, of the great Canadian ambassador in China, expert Chester Ronning, and the next day something happens, and I don't want to tell this story, Audrey. I want you to tell it, because it's for all of us. And I speak to you as somebody who fell in love with somebody through a New York Times assignment. She's seated right there. She is my wife of 30 years, almost 31 years. And I met her in Rio de Janeiro, where I was sent by the New York Times. Seymour Topping met the woman he would fall in love with and marry, and who would become the mother of his 5 children in Nanking, China in 1949. And they met in this very romantic setting. But what I want to leave for Audrey to tell, if you would, is how Top reacted, what he did the next day.
I had been there about a year, and Top had been in Beijing, and I had come from Canada on a troop ship, converted troop ship, to Nanking, Shanghai and Nanking. But that night we had been invited to by Colonel Beebe to the officers' club for a dinner. And as we sat down, my date was a very tall ensign in the American Navy, the son of the assistant to the admiral. But anyway, I was sitting across from Top, and my sister was sitting beside Top, and we met. I looked at Top, and he looked at me, and I just gave him a big smile, and I thought, and he smiled back, and something connected right there, first sight. So anyway, he asked me to dance. Well, first he asked my sister to dance, and I thought, oh, there goes another one. And then he asked me to dance, and we just, then the next day, a rickshaw boy came with a rickshaw full of roses and a very witty note from Top saying, could I have a double date with you and your sister with Bob Clurman? I don't know if you remember Bob. He was out there with the INS, wasn't it? Or UPI. But anyway, I said to Mamie, my sister, who's only 2 years older, and I said, well, I don't know who this Bob Clurman is, and Top wants to have a double date, so what should we do? And she said, well, I don't care. Let's go, but I get the tallest one. So Bob was the tallest one, thank goodness, because I really wanted Top. And so we went out and we've been dating ever since.
Thank you. I'm one of the people Top saved. You sent me to Germany. I got there just as the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia, and I was met by Dave Binder, the bureau chief, and he said, good news, we hear the Russians are going to try to shoot down planes to Berlin, and you're going to be flying the corridor to Berlin, and we'll know if the Russians shoot them down. That's great. So I thank you for that. By the way, you remember an occasion, Top, when the great Phil Doherty, who was writing the advertising column, told you one day that he had written about you in his column. And the way I heard it later from Phil is you were very excited, and listened to the broadcast he was doing on QXR, and it was a broadcast of a column he had written, the advertising column, where he talked about a kind of pudding. And he said that this new kind of pudding had developed a crust, a cake mix that was translucent, and you could see more topping. And he he put that on the air. Phil did. The other story I want to share with you is when after I survived Germany and came back.
May I just interrupt to say, it wasn't the first time pudding was not thrown in my face.
After I came back and survived Germany, I had been assigned to the transportation beat, working with the recently departed Dick Whitkin, a great man who just left our life a couple of days ago. And I remember you called me into the office and you said, Ralph, you're going to be working with Dick Whitkin on the transportation beat. And I said, yes. And you said, there's something you should know about Dick. I said, yes. And you said, well, Top was always very diplomatic. And he said, well, Dick is, yes. Well, he, you know, and I'm on the edge of my seat. Yeah, what? And you said, well, Dick doesn't, he doesn't like trains. Is that it? I said, yeah. He said, he doesn't like trains. I said, okay. He said, well, I want you to like trains. And I did, Top, for you. I like trains a lot. I wrote about them as much as I could, because Dick took the planes. And the last thing I'll just say is I remember a dinner we had in the executive dining room where we would invite foreign visitors and luminaries. And the waiter at the Times executive dining room tripped at one point and spilled a glass of tomato juice all over you. And everybody was horrified to see how you would react. And you just very calmly picked up a napkin and wiped it off and continued the conversation. And I thought afterwards, God forbid if that had happened to Abe. Anyway, to me, that absolutely exemplified your cool and your sophisticated attitude. Anyway, thank you so much for all you've done for all of us.
You know, I'm old enough to remember when radio came in and everyone said, there goes print. And then I remember television saying, there goes radio. And then I remember when we began to have digital, everyone saying, there goes television. Yeah. We are in another stage of transition. And I think the transition is going to work. People of the world are hungry, and I've spent a lot of time in China, and I can tell you how hungry they are hungry for news. And as long as they're hungry for news, there'll always be the media. It'll be in different forms, and maybe the various kinds of media will have to slice the advertising pie in different ways. But we will survive. And the other thing that I would say, you spoke in a sense about yourself and the rest of us in the room. As we have this torrent of information descending on us from every side, the people need journalists, they need editors, they need people like the people in this room to sort things out, to give them the truth and to give them hope and to give them faith. So I say to you, have faith. I do. We're all going to come out well.
I have an inside journalism question. You told us about your exciting career as a foreign correspondent. Now you come back to 43rd Street and you're an editor. That's culture shock. Tell us how you responded to that.
Well, I'll tell you about the first day to start with. Audrey and I were in Berlin. Rather, we were in Bonn. And in the middle of the night, there was a phone call from the managing editor. And he said, come home. We want you to be managing editor. We want you to be foreign editor. Audrey was in the next room, and I stuck my head in to her, and I said, they want us to come back to New York. They want me to be foreign editor. And she said, why not, and turned over and went back to sleep. But they only gave us 10 days to get to New York, and this with our children and 3 cats and a cockatoo and so on. And well, we took off and we made it back there. And the first day, I walked into the office and looked around, and a managing editor said to me, don't worry, Sidney Grusin, who I was replacing, is going to fill you in and on everything. And here comes Sidney. He comes in with that famous bow tie of his, carrying a suitcase, and he takes me into the next room, and he begins to tell me about his tax problems. And then he looks on his watch, and he said, my God, I'm going to miss my plane. Goodbye. And he left for the airport. He was becoming the publisher of the New York Times international edition. So I walked into the next room, and I said to somebody, where does the foreign editor sit? And they pointed out to me where the foreign editor sat, and I sat down, and I was the foreign editor. And now I'm going to tell you tonight a secret that I've never told anyone. In those first 2 weeks that I was sitting there as foreign editor, the real foreign editor was Almeida Gator. Do you all remember her? Bless her.
This has just been fabulous. I want to end the evening asking you a question about how you would react to today's situation with Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, either as managing editor of the Times or as administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, and what the merit of the stories coming out of these revelations is, in your opinion.
Well, I think the Guardian and the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and others handle it very well. The information was out there. and it's our function as news people to publish, and that what was done, we publish it. I can say 3 cheers for Snowden for making that information public. I think possibly it was a public service, but I can't say that I approve of the fact that he did not respect the conditions under which he took his job as a member of the American security.
There you have it. I think that's a good somber note to end on, and I hope you all enjoyed Mr. Topping as much as I did. I'm sure you did. To me, it was just a historic night, and we're really honored to have you be our honoree.
Thank you.
I'm going to just say good night and remind you all, please show up for Ben Smith. It will be a real trip for all of us here and for Ben, who is used to being regarded now as an old whiz kid, and he's so young no one in the room knows who he is. But once you hear him, he will be ubiquitous. You will never go another day without hearing about Ben Smith. So it should be quite interesting. Thank you again for coming.